Good morning and welcome. I am delighted to have this conversation today with my colleague and friend, Kim Charlebois, who is a very special person to me, someone that has inspired me for many years. And I first met her in 2013 at an event called the Victor Walk. This very special project was initiated and hosted by my colleague and friend, Theo Fleury. And in his desire to spread awareness around trauma and sexual abuse, he walked from Toronto to Ottawa, which for those of you who are in a different country is a long walk. And during that event, there was a tremendous amount of pause and connect and visibility around this topic in communities. And one of the most powerful leaders in this conversation was Kim. And so I am so delighted to share her with you and want to invite into this topic an understanding of her work today. So when I first met Kim, she was working at the Women's Sexual Assault Center in Belleville, Ontario, in Canada. And currently, she is the project coordinator of the Women's Sexual Assault Center in Renfrew County, Ontario. And so I wanted to say welcome to you, Kim. And I know that when I do an introduction, it never feels good enough to capture the essence of the wondrousness of who you are. So I want the audience to feel how excited and happy my heart is to have this conversation with you. So welcome.
Thank you, Kim. And it's a real honor and privilege for me to be speaking with you this morning.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this work?
Yeah, so early in my career, I was hired as a frontline therapist for our local Belleville General Hospital, but I was working in their outlying community of Bancroft. And in the work that I did, we saw anyone who came through the door who was living with mental health issues. And through that time there, a lot of the folks that came through the door, excuse me, were survivors of sexual violence. And it ended up being a fair chunk of the work that I did. And I was very, very passionate about it. And I will just very briefly say, I think part of that passion came from the fact that I too am a survivor of sexual violence, childhood sexual abuse. And so it was something that, if I could, I wanted to be able to make a difference in the lives of other survivors. So after a number of years there was an opportunity the executive director position came up at the actual sexual assault center in Belleville. And I was very lucky to end up getting that job, and then spent the next 23 years of my life there in that position. And of course, that's where I was when I had the privilege of meeting you along the trail of the Victor Walk. So, and then at the end of my time there, this position came up in Renfrew County, and they were looking for a project coordinator. And I wasn't 100% sure actually what they were looking for at the time, other than the fact there was the possibility of and conversation around a model. And so I applied for that position, and also thinking that maybe because in my former job as the executive director in Belleville, part of the work was I was able to help create a residential healing center, and it was a one-of-a-kind model. So I sort of thought maybe that's what they're thinking, and that's what they're looking for in Renfrew County. So I did. I was very fortunate and ended up getting that job. And for those of you who see a bit of a tail, my cat has
Love it.
just climbed up onto the table here, and her tail is wagging in front of me. But the interesting thing about that is that because part of the work of, is really involving survivors when you are building something. And so I had the opportunity to meet with hundreds of survivors across Renfrew County. And what they clearly said to me was, that's not at all what we're looking for. In Renfrew County, we don't feel seen, heard, or believed. and we need to have a model that is built on awareness.
Wow.
So yeah, and isn't that so important that we really need to take our direction from survivors and hear what it is that they need. And so that's sort of where I started from in terms of moving forward and trying to create a model that would work for them. And very specifically, this was a model that was to be for women who are survivors of sexual violence, specifically living in rural community.
Okay.
And for folks out there who may not know much about rural Renfrew County, it is a very rural county, uh, and it is actually bigger than the province of Prince Edward Island. But it's also a community that doesn't have any public transportation. So, we're talking, there's a vast geography with people living in remote pockets of the county where they have no access of being able to get into some of the towns or the bigger of the urban areas in the very rural community of Renfrew County. So that's kind of what we were dealing with. I've been thinking along the lines of the difference between the urban and rural, because a lot of times people say to us, well, people in urban communities are sexually assaulted as well. And we absolutely know that. And internally, it's often the same, the effects are the same. But externally, what we know is it's very different in rural community because of those attitudes and stigmas. And yes, the attitudes and stigmas exist in urban communities, but those attitudes and stigmas coexist with many other values.
There's a few words and concepts here that I want to sort of deepen in this conversation. Given that we have a global audience, some of the people who are listening may have never had a conversation about this topic in their lives. And so the term that you use, that of course I'm very familiar with, is sexual violence. And I want to know about how that terminology came to be the way that we describe what we are describing in this conversation, and why that choice of language is so important.
Well, from my perspective, and the reason I use the word sexual violence is it encompasses both sexual abuse and sexual assault. And when often we thought about sexual assault, it tended to be more when we were talking about adults and a crime that was perpetrated by one adult against another, with sex being used as the weapon. Sexual abuse often is the term that we use when we talk more about children who were victims. So for me, in my work, sexual violence encompassed both of those, and it tends to be the word that I use when I'm talking about any type of crime. And because sexual violence is any type of sexual abuse or assault, in Canada, it is a crime. And so sexual violence for me encompasses both of those.
From my perspective, as an occupational therapist and a neurobiology lover, one of the things that I am so focused in my personal interest around sexual violence is what it does to the brain and what it does to our physiology. That it actually, in my language, is a very profound and unique form of trauma that has its own specific unfolding in the physiology that is unique to other forms of violence and other forms of trauma in general. That it's the kind of traumatic experience that has the most significant forms of dissociation
Absolutely.
in relational trauma, and has such a potential to impact at levels of your being that are so difficult to even appreciate and understand. When you look at trauma from the big picture lens, it seems that sexual violence has a very poignant impact that is profound in relationship to other human experiences of suffering. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I agree with you 100%. Sexual violence is the worst crime committed next to homicide. And I mean, well, it does. It probably, most survivors would tell you that it changes their lives for a number of reasons. But I think one of the big ones is shame. So many survivors who I've worked with carry that shame throughout their life. And many people actually seek out help and or heal. There's so many different ways that people can choose to heal, and it certainly can make a difference as they move forward. But most of us who are survivors still see life through the lens of someone who was abused or assaulted, because our life is not the same
Mm.
after we have that. And I don't want to just use the word experience, but once someone is a survivor of sexual violence, they see life through a different lens.
I mean, I know that you and I, in the book that we wrote, Conversations with the Rattlesnake, and you and your work, we talk about this work all the time. And yet, look at how hard it is to be precise in the way that we use our language to describe these experiences because of the importance of creating safety around this topic so that people can hear it, listen to it, open their hearts and minds to this topic from a place of the potential for change. And because it's such a horrific topic, how we talk about it matters so that
Absolutely.
people can lean into this conversation, right?
Yeah, and I think, Kim, there's so much stigma attached to sexual abuse that survivors often feel that for some reason they did something that they deserve it or they were to blame. I in my career I worked with younger people or adults who were abused when they were young, and they talked about how when they were 6 years old that they somehow did something and that they deserved that. And so you carry that, and when you feel like you're to blame, it takes on a whole other it's a whole other level in terms of how people deal with it. And there's a lot of because of the stigma, there's a lot of blame also attached to survivors. And so once again they're hearing and getting messages that perhaps they did something to deserve it.
Mm.
So that is really hard to break away from those thoughts. But I mean, that's part of what happens, the positive things that happen when people are actually able to do the healing work and to recognize that at no point ever were they to blame. They did nothing to deserve it, that all of the blame lays with the perpetrator or the person who committed the crime.
Mm. I think that what's interesting from my perspective as a clinician watching this topic across the lifespan is that in adults, including me, there's a cognitive knowing, perhaps, that I'm not responsible. And then there's a part that doesn't believe that. And it's that dissonance or that conflict in here, that doesn't allow the meaning making or the reorganization of that experience, that you get stuck between your rational adult thought process, perhaps when that happened to you as a child, and how that is related to how you actually feel.
Yes.
And that is often the sticking point, I think, for many adults in their movement towards a reframe of their life's experience.
Yeah, you're so right. And it is just such a difficult topic for people to talk about or even hear about. And just an example, when I used to work in my role as the ED, sometimes we would be invited to health fairs. And so we would have a table there amongst other professionals in other areas, of health. And so we would have a sign that said Sexual Assault Center. And what we would do is we would visibly watch people walking along the rows or the aisles, and they'd be checking out the signs. And as they got close to us, they would visibly back away because it was something that people didn't want to hear about, didn't want to talk about, and perhaps it was touching them on a personal level. But it's something that, again, it's just a really tough topic for people to speak about.
And what's, in my experience, so fascinating in conversations around sexual violence, I'm going to use that word forevermore now, is the prevalence of it. It's so prevalent globally, and yet it is such a topic of horrific abhorrence that's what kind of keeps it in the dark, is this amount of it is incredible, and yet this shame that we're talking about and the feelings of discomfort in the general conversation. I think this is a big part of why you're doing the project you're doing, is to shine the flashlight on this topic from that place of, as you say, awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And when talking about people not being able to come forward, or it's sort of being buried or hidden, that was one of the three areas that we looked at when we were looking at this project overall, and it was about stigma and attitudes. And one of the things that we discovered, because we had hired somebody to do a literature review, so they were able to study communities across the globe, and what we found was that the stigma is so prevalent that that in itself is one of the main deterrents and why people don't come forward to actually disclose, because it's fear. And especially because I'm doing a project that's focused on rural communities, there are attitudes and sometimes values in some rural communities that are different from urban centers, and within those communities, it is often women who are survivors and who might want to reach out for help but don't, is because of that stigma and the way that they would be perceived by family or friends or colleagues in that community for speaking out. And that's one of the reasons that they actually stay silent. And another piece of that as well, which is, I think, different from urban community, it's what we hear people call 6 degrees of separation. So in rural community, everybody somehow is connected to everybody else. So there's a fear around going to the police because perhaps your cousin's husband is an officer, or you don't want to go to the hospital because your aunt works there, or a family friend. And it's, those are the type of things that I heard from survivors when I was meeting with them in terms of why they have never actually come forward.
You use the word survivor, and I know that that word, our mutual friend, Theo Fleury, he uses the word victor. And the word victim and survivor is an activation for him. And so speak for just a moment around the language of surviving and why that word is so important in this conversation.
Well, for me, it's a really important word. And in my history of the work, I'm going to say maybe 20, 25 years ago is when we started to use that word. And it was really empowering. And it was a way sort of to take back control, because it doesn't eliminate the fact that a sexual abuse or an assault occurred. But what it means is that we are not going to continue to give our power to the perpetrator, that we are going to move forward in our life and do what we need to do to be successful as survivors.
I could feel it when you said it that way. There was one time Theo and I were speaking to the Toronto Sex Crimes Unit. This story is really in my memory as such a profound experience. And so these were police officers who were in the front line investigating sex crimes of all natures, predominantly sexual assault and sexual abuse. And it was in a movie theater. The original conversation that we were to have with the unit was a small meeting, and then the word was out, and they needed to rent the Silver City Theater because there were so many officers. And there was one particular experience that I will never forget because, you know, we were down there on the little stage and the theater was full, and way at the back in the right-hand corner, I can see him, was this officer that was, I don't know, 6'7", he felt like. He was just huge. And, you know, Theo is 5'6", so there is a big difference in height, but not in energy. And the officer started to speak about, and he used the word victim, and came at this from, you know, the dialogue was around the investigation for the victim, and Theo's energy was getting elevated and hot. And so we said, stop, something like this. Stop talking about the victim. And the conversation started out quite intense in anger, and then it shifted to tears. It was so powerful because the officer's intent, he said, I witness every day the impact of this type of violence on people's lives, and it's traumatizing me. And it's not that they are victims in my mind, it's that I'm in a position of service and of opportunity to make this be different. And I feel like my power to get in there and do this horrible job is because I hold, and he used the word, the victim in mind. And then this gave us a reframe, gave Theo a reframe to the word victim. That here was, because victim in his perception had this shaming into, you know, implication to it. You're a victim because you didn't do something from your own being to prevent this from happening. I think that's how he would have heard it. And in that, the reason I'm telling this story is the dialogue that arose from that word shifted the entire collaborative experience for both of them as to how they experience both themselves and their mission. And so even though we might not get the language right, it's that willingness to lean into those conversations that deeply creates this potential for change.
Yeah, absolutely. And language is so powerful. But, you know, when we think of the word victim, it's a label, as are so many labels. And labels can be dangerous, you know, because people then often perceive themselves as just that, whatever that label happens to be. And it sometimes stifles the willingness or the ability to be able to move forward. So, yeah, what you're saying in that experience must have been absolutely so incredibly powerful.
You also talked about in your mission of your current project, you used the word believed. To be seen, what was your second word?
To be heard.
To be heard and to be believed.
Yes.
Can you talk about be believed?
Yeah. It makes all the difference in the world. And I'll go back to, again, in my work and the things that we knew, particularly about children who were being victimized, who were being sexually assaulted or sexually abused as children. And what we know is if two children are having the same experience, being sexually abused by the same person, and they both disclose to someone, be it a parent, be it a teacher, somebody in their life, the child who was believed
Mm.
versus the child who was not believed the first time they disclose have a very different healing journey. And so it is just so important that we believe children and adults when they tell us that they have had an experience,
Mm.
because it really makes a difference in terms of how they are able to move forward. Because the child that, was not believed continues to, often the perpetration is still continuing because nobody believed them. They thought they were making it up or that they had done something to deserve it. And so often the abuse doesn't stop. Where in the situation for the child who was believed, often that person has the power to do something to make a change so that the abuse stops and it never happens again for that person. And also for someone to just know that they told somebody and that they believed them, that means that they're important and what they had to say was important, and it's just that simple.
Mm. I think you and I have both witnessed, uh, and I will never forget in Ottawa on the steps of Parliament, the power of disclosure, of sharing your story. And, we've witnessed so many individuals come forth and tell their their secret that is lived in their being for some of them 70, 80 years. I mean, this is a story close to home in my own family where a family member was in her 80s when she first disclosed for the first time her own history of sexual violence, and just how the power of the release of that energy into a held space by someone who shows up, who sees you, who hears you, and who values and believes you, and how that is such it can't be underestimated, the importance of that experience in the healing process. And this is often a topic of conversation because people are often worried about to whom they tell their story.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, saying it out loud, writing it down, getting it out of here
Mm.
makes such an incredible difference. And, and what a gift to the person who was able to hold space and to be there and to, just be there for that person to be able to tell you their story. And individual counseling is, I think there's positives for both individual counseling and group work. A lot of my work in my past job at the healing retreat was based on group work, so we would have 10 people who would come and spend a week with us. And I can tell you the incredible, powerful stories that people were able to share. And had that story held by 10 other people, one being the therapist, but most importantly, it was the other 9 people who were in the group with them because they were peers. They were fellow survivors who had gone through similar experiences, and so for them to be there for each other and to support each other and to hold space, so when you talk about people thinking about who, they want to share that story with, I think that for a lot of people, we think that it has to be a doctor or our faith leader or an experienced counselor or therapist. But what we know is for many people, just being able to share it with somebody and
Mm.
somebody who believed them when they told them that story made such an incredible difference in their life.
Mm. You talked about your retreat center. It's a space of which I have so much reverence for, having been there myself. And it's an incredible accomplishment. And as you said earlier in the conversation, a one of a kind. Can you speak just for a moment about that labor of love that you brought to Canada?
Well, it was very much a team effort. It was the women at the Sexual Assault Center for Quinian District who, had been providing individual counseling in groups for years. And, we often talked about what more we could be doing. And often people would say, I've done individual counseling, I've been to group, but I'm still sort of feeling this. And is there anything else out there? And what we recognized after doing a fair bit of research is in terms of sexual violence, there really wasn't anything else out there. But what we did notice were that there were treatment program, residential centers, facilities for people who weren't necessarily survivors of sexual violence, but who may have an eating disorder or may have an addiction to alcohol or drugs. There were places where they could go and spend a significant period of time to focus on getting well. And so we talked a lot about that, and the idea of, what about a retreat? What about a healing center for men and women who are, and I say men and women because at the Sexual Assault Center for Quindian District, all of their services are equally available to men and women. So, it was a dream, and we all dreamed it, and we, sort of decided that we'd like to sort of move forward with it and make it happen. And so we actually really wanted it to be something that was grassroots and holistic. Because from the work that we did and from the people that we had, the thousands of people who had come through the door over the years and told us their stories, we really felt that was so vitally important. And so we were able to finally, after 3 attempts of, writing away to the government and asking for some dollars, and we were basing it on at that time, a typical, it was a 28-day, a lot of the healing retreat centers were 28 days long. And so we asked for that, and 2 times we were turned down. On the 3rd time, they said, can't do it, but here, if you want, we'll give you enough money to do a 7-day program and enough money to try it 3 times. It was a small grant, but it was enough money to develop and put together a 7-day program. So that's how it started, and we did that. And what we had to do is we had to rent spaces across the county to go away for the 7 days because we didn't have space enough at our center. And of course, we wanted a place that was out in the country where it was in nature, so we did that, and we did that for 12 different times before we finally were funded to be able to do the program on an ongoing basis. And then we had to find an actual place to live, because it became an awful onerous task, moving all of our equipment and our kayaks, and because there was many different components to the healing retreat, from one end of our county to the other. So we ended up doing a $1 million fundraising campaign to raise money for the retreat center, and that is how I met Theo. He actually agreed to come to our community and participate in one of our fundraising golf tournaments, and he actually did that for 2 years. And those are the things we created it, that we raised $1 million, and we purchased the Paths of Courage Healing Retreat Center down in Prince Edward County, and had enough money to be able to offer 12 different programs a year. And it was incredibly successful, and still is very successful. The program continues on, and we're very fortunate that people from all over Ontario are able to come and be part of it. So it wasn't just limited to our catchment area, and it is open to both men and women who are survivors of sexual violence.
Wow. There are 2 things that you said in that little story that I just want to link back into. One is that we know, or I know in my experience, that there is a connection between a history of sexual violence and mental health related issues. And you talked about that in looking at eating disorders and addictions as 2 examples.
Yes.
But both in the literature and in reality, there is such a strong link between thriving and surviving in a mental health way and a history of sexual violence. That it
absolutely
it can show up in so many other places and be in the background.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, and both of those places that I talked about, facilities for eating disorders, facility for other types of addictions, for many of those folks, they would tell you that they were living with the effects, the addiction, because it was a way to cope from the trauma of being a survivor of sexual violence. There's very, very strong correlations between those.
That's an important thing. I really want our listeners to say, to hear you say, because we talk about all the time that there's always a reason for why people do what they do. And so much of how humans adapt to their suffering is to find coping strategies for things that have been so horrific in their history.
Yeah.
At Paths of Courage, I know that you had programs also for men. And, this conversation we're having today is about your project from the Women's Sexual Assault Center. But for just a moment, can you talk about men and sexual assault in men and how much of an even less talked about conversation that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I was very fortunate to be at the Sexual Assault Center in Belleville, where our board of directors was very supportive of our team working with both men and women, because we believe it should not matter what one's gender is or how one identifies.
Mm,
Sexual violence, as I said, is the second most serious crime committed next to homicide. Anybody who's a victim is deserving of support and help and healing.
mm,
And in Ontario and in most places, there are still very few programs available or counseling available, free counseling available for males. Um, and we know that the numbers are very high. And you and I earlier talked about numbers. And numbers are something that I'm often, everybody's got a different stat, but for the longest time, um, we heard that with women, it was 1 in 2 or 1 or 3 in our lifetime who would be a victim of sexual violence, and we were told with males that it would be 1 in 5. Now, those numbers may differ today. I'm not sure, but those were the numbers that we used for quite a while. But what I can tell you is, even though there were less males who were victims, they were still equally deserving of support. Um, and most of the men that we worked with who came through our doors either for one-to-one counseling or who were coming for a group or who came to Paths of Courage, to the retreat center, major majority of them were sexually abused as children. Now we know that men also can be sexually assaulted and are sexually assaulted. I think it's still going to take some time before more of those folks will come forward to disclose. But most of the fellows that we were dealing with were children. And I think one of the reasons that it's taken a long time for men to come forward, two things, and they're both kind of myths, that we hear stories about perpetrators, and then when we get into their life, they often tell us that they were sexually abused as children, and in many cases that's true. But what that came to be and what people started to believe, that must mean then that every boy who is sexually abused will grow up to be a perpetrator, which is completely untrue, not true at all. But what it did is it kept a lot of men from coming forward because of that fear that they would be perceived as a perpetrator. And the other issue that has kept men silent is the issue of homophobia,
mm,
because the majority of men who we see, their perpetrators were men.
mhm,
And so, and mostly as children. And often, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're a little boy or a little girl. I mean, our physiology is such that we can't control how our body reacts. And I remember stories from men talking about when they were sexually abused by a man, their body reacted. And so they thought that they must have liked it or must have wanted it, which in their mind meant that perhaps that meant they were going to be or were a homosexual. And we know again that that is completely and totally untrue, because our body can respond and it doesn't matter what the gender of the person is. So that, because there's so much homophobia in our society, and so it keeps so many people
mm,
silent. They don't want people to think that that might be who they are. And that's a lot of the work that we've done on our crisis lines at sexual assault centers, those that answer the calls from men, because information is power. So just being able to share with them that it makes no difference that your body may have responded, that in no way determines your sexuality, right?
mm,
And that's just such a relief for so many people. And at the same time, it does not matter what one's sexual orientation is. Everybody is deserving of support, and there's no judgment on someone depending on how they identify. But I know for a lot of people that was a huge relief and an understanding, to think that no, I'm not going to grow up and I'm not going to become a perpetrator. And again, these are usually adult men telling us these things and still worry that in their life, perhaps that might mean that they will be a perpetrator. So what a relief to know that that's not the case. But that's the power of stigma and myths in terms of how they can affect us and how they can, keep people silent for so long. So that's a little bit of the stuff and the work that we did with men and the things that we learned.
Thank you for that. Before we end this incredibly candid, safe, and powerful, game-changing conversation, can you please come back to your current project? And what is your mission? What's it look like? How can we support you? We support you in the month of May as your project is out there in the community.
Absolutely. I'll give you just a little bit of history. I was hired, as I said, in 2017, and the criteria was to create a model for women who are survivors specifically in rural communities. They really wanted this to focus on rural and what the differences were and what were the needs of women in rural community. And they were looking at the bigger picture, but they focused it specifically on Renfrew County. So after meeting with all those survivors that I spoke about earlier, and hearing what they wanted, awareness was the big word. They felt that they did not have enough service, enough representation in their communities, and they needed more awareness so people would understand and be able to hear them and see them and believe them. So we had to come up with a model that, first of all, I should say, as you well know, Kim, when people apply for grants and when you get project dollars, you get money to create something initially, and then your project's done and there's no more money. So what we really wanted to do was create something that was sustainable, and figuring out a way to do that was an important piece of this project. So in the end, it was a 5-part model that was built. One of the things we did was we did groups. Renfrew County had been in existence, I think, for about 23 years at the time I started there. And they had done a lot of individual support and public education and a lot of really fabulous work in their community, but they hadn't yet run any groups for survivors. So we were able to create a group model and them to be able to start offering groups to the community. So that was one of the pieces of the model. One of the other things survivors said to us is they would like us to do an event or a workshop once a year, bringing in different speakers and different topics in the area of sexual violence so that they could learn. And they also wanted us to do something so that the people that would support them in the community, be they service providers or just people in general who might want to know more about sexual violence, would be able to attend. So that was one of the things we built into it as well, so that we could have workshops both for survivors and for the support, the people that were supporting them as well. We also created a self-advocacy journal. And this is it's like a 73-page booklet, and I wanted it to have lots of great information, but I wanted it to also look kind of like a personal journal with lots of places for them to do notes and draw and color mandalas, and lots of self-care stuff in this journal for them. And really, it was created for the women who may not yet be ready to come through the doors of an organization or a mental health agency to ask or reach out for support. So we did that. So that was the third piece of it. Then the other thing is, because I shared with you that Renfrew County is such a large demographic geographically, there's little pockets and no public transportation for people who live an hour and a half away to get into Pembroke, which is probably the most urban of the Renfrew County. So what we did is we called it our community of practice, and we reached out to multitudes of folks, those who were service providers, those who were in private practice, those who had business, people in general, asking them if they would agree to become part of this community of practice. And what that meant was, each year they would offer one event or one workshop or one activity for survivors only. And the thinking was it would be an opportunity in all the different parts of the county to have something that might be close by a survivor so that they get to something. So let's say we have 20 people part of our community of practice. We'd have 20 events throughout the year in different parts of the county. And they were doing this for free. And we asked that they would do it each year. And though, so one of the people said to me, but I don't know a lot about sexual violence. And we said, you don't have to, because we're not actually asking you to provide sexual violence work. What we're asking you to do is create a space where survivors can come and be together. So I have one woman who runs she has a restaurant and a catering company. So she agreed to do a cooking class for us.
Amazing.
So yeah, people can come to that cooking class, and she's not going to talk at all about sexual abuse or sexual assault. She's going to be teaching them, and they're going to be making some meals to take away with them. But the real powerful thing here is that those people that are in that room are only survivors. And so it's an opportunity for them to connect with each other and to build community, and that's the kind of thing that if we can continue on, we don't necessarily need a lot of money to continue that on and to make that happen. So that was the part, the big piece around the community of practice. And then I guess the number one component of the model is a campaign that we created, and it's an awareness campaign called We Stand with Survivors. And what we wanted to do originally was, again, because there's a number of towns and small, I don't know if we'd call them cities, but there's a number of communities that are more urban that have town councils. And so what we thought, let's create a banner campaign. And so what we did is we had a professional street-sized banner created that said, "We stand with survivors," in French and English. And we approached one community. We approached the community of Eganville and their town council. And we asked them during the month, and we picked the month of May because it is Sexual Assault Survivor Month. And so we picked that month to be the month that we would do our campaign. And so we asked Eganville if they would hang our banner for the month of May. And they agreed. And our goal was that in the term of the project, that by the end of the project, we'd have 4 communities hanging the banner during the month of May. But we would start the first year with one community, and then next year they would hang it again, but we'd invite a second community, and so on. And so that is what we did. And this year, as of May, we have 5 communities in Renfrew County right now currently hanging our street-sized banners. We have 30 businesses in each of those communities hanging a poster in their storefront business that says, "We stand with survivors." So that's actually, it's 4 of the communities doing that piece of it. So there's 120 plus posters now hanging in front store businesses, 5 banners hanging. And then we last year expanded what I should say. Okay, so that was the model itself, and the model was over. And then they actually granted us another 2.5-year project to build it and grow it in Renfrew County, but to expand it into other communities in Canada. So that's what we're doing now. So we were able to move it outside Renfrew County to a sister agency last year. They hung our banner in the community of Perth, and they're hanging it this year in Smiths Falls. And we also have brought on the community of Timmins and the community of Muskoka this year. So it's growing in that regard, and we know there's other folks coming on next year. But by next May, our intention is to have several other provinces involved, with communities in different provinces hanging our banner. And it's it's really subtle, yet incredibly powerful. I mean, it's a banner, but it's there and it's hanging and it's huge and it's 24, 28 feet long, and it's on a main street. And, so survivors see it. And year after year, what we're finding out, and the reason we're finding out is we go back at the end of May and pick up all those posters, and we ask the businesses if anybody asked about the poster, if anybody in their business talked about it, their staff. And we're hearing amazing stories about what people are recognizing and seeing. And because we're doing it over and over again each year and it's growing, it's becoming more and more familiar. So survivors are feeling more seen and more heard and more believed in their communities. It's their way of letting people know we're here.
Wow, Kim.
So yeah, so it's been very exciting. It's been powerful. It's been wonderful. This year when we went back, as soon as we walk through a business door, it's like we're being recognized, and absolutely we want to hang the poster. And one little story, in one of the communities when we went back, and this was actually a bank, a credit union, and we said, did any of your staff have any conversation? And she said, it's very interesting, she's because in Eganville, there is a monument
Mm.
for survivors of sexual violence.
Okay.
And so the woman at the bank said, we knew that there was a monument here in our park, and none of our staff had ever visited it. So what we did during this campaign is we all decided to bring a brown bag lunch, and we took our lunch and we all went and had our lunch at the monument. So, that's the power of the campaign, because those people will go home and tell other people about what they did. And they'll know about the monument, and they'll know about the campaign, and many of those people that they're talking to are survivors.
Wow.
So people begin to feel like they're important and that they matter, and that we are telling them that they matter because we are supporting them with the campaign.
Wow. Kim Charlebois, you are such a trailblazer. And I'm just thinking about the whole world. This model that you have created is such a powerful, doable, sustainable mechanism that can be replicated over and over and over again.
That's what we want to do, because again, it's not an expensive campaign. The most expensive part is to purchase the banner, and then to have staff that can make sure it gets hung each year. But yeah, it's really in the big picture, it's very cost effective, and so people in even remote communities. And the thing about it is, and this is the other thing, I was talking to some people from the north. They didn't have any money, so we were going to get them to create banners, and the students and the people part of the group were going to just draw and create it, and they were going to hang it in their community center. So there's so many ways that we can do it to let survivors know that we support them.
How do people connect to you? How do they connect to this project? What is a way that they can contact you or the organization to acquire more information, irrespective of where they might live in the world?
Absolutely. And we would welcome people from anywhere in the world to contact us if they'd like information. And we would welcome them to be a part of our team and, to hang a banner in their community, or to make a banner or a poster, whatever they wanted to do to let survivors know that they support them. But they could contact me if they want to. My number is 613-401-3623. And I'm at the project for another year. But they can also call the center directly, and that's the Women's Sexual Assault Center in Renfrew County. And the number is 613-735-5551. And that would be the best way for them to contact us. And they can ask to speak to Robin or Jancy, and they would be happy to provide them with information. And we would welcome them to join us.
And so I want to, on behalf of Relationship Matters, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you do, all the work that you've done, and for all the awareness and love that you bring to the world. So thank you so much for the conversation with me this morning, and for inspiring so many people to become their best self. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. And again, it's been a real honor to be here and to speak with you. So.